Today's date is November 5th, 1935. We are reporting live from New York City, checking up on how our country's citizens are doing post-World War II. Good morning, miss. How are you? I want to know what your opinion of all this going on right now is in terms of politics here in our country. What do you think politicians are doing to help you?
My name is Chelsea. Everyone is definitely much better off than they were before.
What do you mean?
FDR and politicians have been working double and triple time to fulfill their 3 R's.
Explain to me a little bit about these 3 R's.
Relief, recovery, and reform are what FDR and politicians have been trying to do to our country. They have established organizations such as the NAR, AAA, and CCC, all of which have aimed to bring the U.S. back to its feet by means of bringing in new jobs, new methods of banking, regulation, and places for jobless men to farm and get land.
Yeah. What about your brother? He's, I assume, back to the effect of the crash?
My cousin over here lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and has more to say about the economics post-World War Wall Street stock market crash. Don't you, Jason?
Yes, indeed. We were cheated out of our money once times started getting tough. Most people have been great breadwinners beforehand, but now they were on the dole for the next meal. And those who were lucky, for the ones sharing their wealth, they were the sole providers of sustenance for their community.
How have things changed since then?
The politicians of our country have really tried to do their best in creating jobs and a good flow of money in the economy. I can safely say that since the crash, there have been at least 40% more jobs and much less people off the streets from being jobless. We made considerable headway since the immediate time period after the crash.
Tell us a little bit about that.
There have been many articles about the Great Depression. To some, they were just a bunch of words. To those that lived through it, it would never be forgotten. Something was instilled in my character that will remain for me for the rest of my life. The good old days were not good old days. For millions that were out of work, cold, and hungry, life in the year after the crash was as such. At the company store, loaves of bread were 10 cents, a quart of milk was 10 cents, a dozen eggs 10 cents, and so on and so forth. We couldn't even sustain our own lives. There was just not enough money to buy these essentials to sustain life.
What do you see for us in the near future?
I see the U.S. recovering completely in the next 10 to 12 years. Things are already on the upswing.
Chelsea, what do you have to say about the immigration acts in the U.S. businesses and foreign affairs?
We have tried to keep out of foreign affairs by keeping our country to ourselves, by making influential changes, while still maintaining peace.
What changes have you seen?
I've been reading up in all the newspapers about what's going on, and I think that the fact that the U.S. is staying out of most of the fighting going on in Europe is very smart. We, as a country, may put our opinion as to how things should be done. By staying out as much as possible is our best bet. FDR has made many moves towards neutrality with other countries.
In terms of foreign military aid, what have you seen?
Our country has seen that he has also met with Congress to make peace with other nations by joining the League of Nations and by loaning few nations money for financial and military aid.
Tell me what you know about that.
The Immigration Act of 1924 placed restrictions of immigration from Asia, India, and Africa. This was a move that helped the U.S. get back on its feet after the crash.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for so much, Chelsea and Jason.
Good evening and welcome to News for America, where you hear the news as it happens. I'm your host, Razi Benet. The economy expanded greatly during the 1920s. Many Americans made a great deal of money on the stock market, and wages for workers increased as well. However, economic growth ended suddenly with the stock market crash this October 1929. In that month, the stocks for many leading companies fell sharply, and they continued to fall in the months that followed. Many Americans lost great amounts of money, and the public at large lost faith in the economy. Soon the economy was in ruins, and businesses were closing their doors. President Hoover tried to solve the crisis, but he was not willing to take the strong actions that were needed to end it. As time passed, many Americans began to blame Hoover for the terrible economic depression. The very rich lost money on Wall Street, but they could afford it. But the most of America could not afford any loss of money. This had a very large economic impact on these people could no longer afford to spend money and therefore did not buy consumer products. Therefore, as there was no buying, shops went busy and factories had no reason to employ people who were making products that were not being sold. Therefore, unemployment became a major issue. The Depression took a while to get going, but by the winter of 1932, it was at its worst.
Congratulations, Franklin Roosevelt has won the election.
Woo!
Okay. Democrat Franklin Roosevelt was elected mainly because he promised to try new solutions to end the Great Depression. I'm sure many of you have seen his great speech last night at your fireplaces.
I are beginning to spend. The man across the street has a new car. These are the things that indicate better times and show that under Roosevelt's leadership, America is going forward.
And we're back. The 1920s and 30s also brought basic change in how Americans dealt with many of their social and economic problems. The 1920s generally were a period of economic growth with little government intervention in the day-to-day lives of the people. But the terrible conditions of the Great Depression during the 1930s forced Roosevelt and the federal government to experiment with the new policies. The government began to take an active role in offering relief to the poor. It started programs to give food and money to poor people, and it created jobs for workers. The government grew in other ways. It created major programs for farmers. It set regulations for the stock market. It built dams, roads, and airports. Now we're going to hear from Joe Bolton, your average farmer.
Top of the morning to y'all. There are dust bugs, extreme heat, and winter cold. Me living in New York County don't have hot heat, light, or indoor bathrooms like people who lived in town. We raise most of our own foods, eggs, chicken, milk, beef from my own cows, and vegetables from my garden. No one has any saved money. We are all the same boat. Us neighbors helped each other through hard times, sickness, and accidents. We need to stick together. Farm families get together with our neighbors at school programs, church, dinner, and dances. Children and adults found ways to have fun for free, playing board games, listening to the radio, or going to outside movies in town. We only get $3.50 a day. When the dryness, heat, and grasshoppers destroy our crops, we are left with no money to buy groceries or pay for our farm bills. Some of my neighbors lost hope and moved away. Many young men are taking government jobs building roads and bridges.
Social protests increased during the 1920s and 30s. Some blacks in great numbers moved from the southern part of the country to northern and central cities. Here's Louis IV Smith.
I am from Bronzeville area, known as Black Metropolis. It is a fairly rich neighborhood. Jazz legend Louis Armstrong lived there, and so did Ida B. Wells, until hard times came. But now, the men can't get jobs, and especially the black men. Here I am with a degree in chemistry, and I can't get a job. I'm humiliated. I fell apart, so my wife took what work she could find as a live-in domestic worker. My family was boarded out. I have young children. I have to send to my family to live with relatives and sometimes even with strangers. I told my kids this is the way it has to be. We either do it and survive, or don't do it and don't survive. One house we lived in, there were 19 of us in 6-room house. We learned to share and cooperate. We got called names. Once kids called my daughter a pack rat.
The 1920s and 30s is a time of change for women. Women are beginning to wear less conservative kinds of clothing. Washing machines and other inventions allow them to spend less time doing housework. Women could smoke or drink in public, at least in large cities, and many women have jobs. The 1920s and 30s also were important periods in the arts. George Gershwin wrote his Rhapsody in Blue, original for piano and jazz band. It later went on to become a symphony concert favorite. Writers such as Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, Eugene O'Neill, and others made this what many called the golden age of American writing. Frank Lloyd Wright and other architects designed great buildings for American cities. Film actors like Clark Gable and radio entertainers like Jack Benny did more than make Americans laugh or cry. They also helped unite the country. Millions of Americans could watch or listen to the same show at the same time. Politics, the economy, social traditions, art are all changing for Americans in these hard times, and many of these changes are also affecting other countries beyond Americans' border. However, the change that had the most meaning for the rest of the world was the change produced by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Here's what Franklin Roosevelt had to say on that.
When I spoke with you about the fall of Rome, I knew at that moment that troops of the United States and our allies were crossing the Channel in another and greater operation.
I live in Pearl City, on a peninsula which jutted out into the Pearl Harbor, parallel to Ford Island, on which the Naval Air Station was based. On December 7, 1941, a very loud explosion rattled our windows. We rushed outside to see a string of airplanes in a shallow dive towards the ships at the end of our peninsulas. We could see red anti-aircraft tracer shells floating up toward the lead aircraft. I could see the rising sun emblem that decorated the side of the aircraft, which identified them as Japanese. My wife and our friends who lived nearby went up to the hills to hide in a cave, and I caught a boat to Ford Island. I saw sunken U.S. Navy ships on both sides of Ford Island burning ferociously. When I went into the barricades later in the day, I saw long rows of dead and injured sailors lying on the floor.
What were you or what were you doing at the time of the bombing?
We were contemplating going to church when the first bomb fell. The attack lasted over a period of time which extended to my arrival at the Naval Air Station. Johnny was on her way up to the hills.
What was it like watching Pearl Harbor get destroyed?
Watching Pearl Harbor being destroyed and thousands of lives lost put most of us in a state of shock. I saw no fear manifested by the people around me. We all responded as we had been trained. The first day, I manned a machine gun. The second day, I repaired airplanes as fast as I could. A few days later, those of us who had families were allowed to go look for them. I could not find my wife of 4+ months, but learned she was safe. Later, we were allowed one night each fourth day of the base. We were working 12 hours. Minus 12 hours off. It was exhausting, but repaired airplanes were moving out. I remember one PBY racing down the harbor for a test flight. It had not been painted after repair and was more patched than original skin. I named it the Flying Patch.
What did it feel like to be in the midst of the bombing?
Being in the midst of the bombing and such mass destruction was mind-numbing. I went to my duty station, the fire department, to find no people and no equipment. They were fighting fires, so I joined the line to draw a weapon. I selected a machine gun.
How bad was the destruction?
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor appeared to be aimed primarily at other ships and airplanes. I remember no buildings being bombed. However, the hangars at the Army's air stations had been thoroughly machine gunned and other aircraft was destroyed.
Thank you for watching.